It is one of the great tragedies of my life that I have never learnt to speak German. I'm serious, really, truly. My grandmother was Viennese. I loved her very much. We were very, very close. She died 20 years ago this year, and she'd always lament me in the heavy Viennese accent in English. She spoke with this very beautiful English. Why did you never learn German? And my excuse was that when I was 13, I went to this wonderful school where you had to choose between German and ancient Greek. And I had started in ancient Greek when I was 8 or 9, and I loved ancient Greek, and I thought, I'm going to just stick with ancient Greek. And it was just this cruel, cruel dilemma that I was faced with, and I have been trying to catch up ever since. And I try to read a little bit of German every day. I've worked a bit in my academic research on Immanuel Kant and Martin Heidegger. But as my German friends point out, if you wanted to learn German, those are probably not the two thinkers you should be starting with. In fact, I had one German friend tell me the other day, you're trying to read Kant in German? We don't read Kant in German. And apparently it's true. They read the Cambridge English translation of Kant because it's a lot easier than the original Kant. So thank you for hearing me out. It's in English, and I hope that you can understand most of what I have to say. The topic that Johannes invited me to address, and I do love it when I'm given a topic rather than having to make one up, as it were, and was the verse from St. John, chapter 8, verse 32. For you shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Gnostheste ten alethean kai her alethea eleutherose homas. It's in the Greek, and the reason I start with the Greek is because I think we need to get to grips with what we mean by freedom. The word that's used there, eleutheria, is a word familiar to classical Greece, and it's freedom understood primarily in the political sense. That's the standard meaning of eleutheria, freedom, political freedom, freedom from constraint. And yet that's plainly not the sense in which the writer, is certainly not the sense in which Jesus of Nazareth intends freedom to be understood. What we have, in fact, is a sense of freedom from sin, a kind of moral perfection. That is what he is referring to, and if you look at the way in which Paul later picks up this sense of freedom, for freedom Christ has set you free, it's an idea of being free from the captivity of the world rather than free from, as it were, just a political captivity. This touches on a deep philosophical issue. How is it that knowing the truth about something can bring moral freedom, can bring a sense of moral stability, moral purity? This seems like a very strange idea. It's not unique to Jesus. In Plato's dialogue, the Protagoras, Socrates insists that no one ever goes wrong knowingly. Oudes hamartane hekon. Socrates' idea is that moral failure is mental failure, and that if you just knew the good, you understood the good with your mind, with your cognition, then you would start doing good. Now, anybody who, like me, works in the field of ethics knows that knowing a lot about ethics does not mean that you act ethically. One of my students mischievously informed me the other day of a study that had been conducted in the United States, which showed apparently that not only was it not the case that ethics lecturers in moral philosophy did not return their library books within the time alongside at the benchmark of other lecturers. They were worse. They were actually statistically significantly worse, less ethical in returning their library books. And so this strange connection between knowing the truth and a kind of moral freedom, this is not obvious. It's not obvious at all. And indeed, there's a wonderful passage in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 7. And it's very funny. Aristotle's not that funny generally, or at least the lecture notes of his students. This is the poor Aristotle. I often wonder what would happen if my ideas were refracted through the lecture notes of my students. And unfortunately, as with Wittgenstein, Aristotle too is at the mercy of the students scribbling lectures, scribbling notes on his lectures. But Aristotle has this passage in Book 7 of the Nicomachean Ethics where he says, this is obviously wrong. And he quotes Socrates, this is a crazy idea. We know every day that when faced with a choice between various options, we know we should have the salad for lunch and not the hamburger. If we're trying to be healthy and not the ice cream, we're perfectly aware of the consequences of both options. And yet I don't choose the salad, I go for the ice cream. I knowingly choose what I know to be less conducive to my flourishing. Aristotle says this just seems obvious. And he couldn't really explain that. But you do in the New Testament start to see this theme be explored more and more. In Romans 7 in particular, there's that wonderful passage where Paul talks about this sense of, I can see the good, I know the good, I know what I want to do, and yet I don't do it. Who will rid me of this body of death? And what Paul has got in mind there is this sense of who will give me this freedom from this body of sin, this freedom from moral corruption. So what's the answer here? Well, as I was reflecting on this yesterday on the plane over, I think the answer is in the title of this conference, Welt ohne Logos. There's the only bit of German I'm going to try. The world without Logos. Logos, within the Greek Hellenic tradition, is primarily a matter of cognition. But of course, what have we learnt at the beginning of John's Gospel? We've learnt that the Logos is not merely cognition, nor is it some principle that informs the universe, as the Stoics believed. The Logos is a person, like you and like me. And so knowing the truth is not simply propositional knowledge, but relational knowledge. You are very fortunate in German to have that distinction between Wissen and Kennen. We don't have that distinction in English, and it causes all sorts of philosophical problems. Or connaître and savoir and conoscere and sapere. It's a very important distinction. And gnotheste, the word that's used in the Greek, also carries that ambiguity. But you can know there's propositional knowledge and there's personal knowledge. And the great genius of this verse, of this way of understanding it, is that it unites. It's not to say that we deny propositional knowledge. It's to say that we include within how we understand the world, the truth is not simply propositions. The truth, understanding the truth and knowing the truth, and understanding the truth in a way that is going to bring moral freedom with it, is something that is much more incarnational and full-bodied and relational, much less Platonic. It's worth pausing for a moment and considering what do other traditions make of this puzzle? How do other traditions think about freedom and knowledge? This is a good apologetic strategy, generally. You will find, if you cleave to Orthodox Christian commitments in the public square in Germany today, and certainly in the United Kingdom, that these feel very contentious. You will feel the hostility towards them. But I find it's very useful to try to force the other person's views to the surface. Apart from anything else, contrast is the mother of clarity. When you can start to see and compare these different perspectives, you start to understand your own perspective an awful lot better. What does secular modernity have to say about freedom? Well, I think that story is really a story that is downstream of Immanuel Kant. Kant's great moment of genius in the early 1780s was to try to resolve this great problem. Roughly speaking, how do we reconcile a Newtonian universe of mechanism, of cause, that is universally scientifically describable? How do we fit into that mechanistic universe of physics and causes and effects ourselves, our souls, freedom, and God? There doesn't seem to be room for those two categories. Now, it's fashionable to criticize Kant, and I'm very, very critical of Kant, but I think we need to understand the pathos that's driving him in the 1770s. He is trying to reconcile the world of science with the world of religion and soul and freedom. And though he fails, or at least I think he fails, it is an extraordinary attempt at the level of Newton's own attempt within physics. And what he does is he tries to bring together, through transcendental idealism, a picture of reality where you can have both. You have the phenomenal realm, in which you can do all the science you like, and then the noumenal realm beyond that, where you are, as it were, outside the world of science, and that's where you can put freedom and the soul and God. Now, that is the picture that kept going into the 19th century. Then it starts to unravel as philosophy gets more materialistic, in effect. And here's what I think happens. You have a split. We have the nursery rhyme of Humpty Dumpty in England. Humpty Dumpty has a great fall, and everyone's trying to put him back together again. So Kant has a fall, and it shatters. And so effectively what you see in European philosophy is two competing understandings of freedom. The first understanding that comes in the wake of Darwin is that there's no such thing as freedom. As Richard Dawkins says, at the bottom of the universe, we are not free, there is no goodness, there is no evil. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. It's a completely deterministic picture. This is the dominant orthodoxy of secular modernity. No freedom, no good. Because at least on one thing, Kant is right. If there's no freedom, there's no morally responsible agency. Ought implies can. If you're telling me that I ought to do something, you are also telling me that I am free not to do it. Right? No point telling me that I ought to do something that it is physically impossible for me to do. So what happens if that freedom disappears? Morally significant agency disappears. So there's an immediate response to those who are hostile or critical to the weight that the Christian tradition places on freedom. Determinism gets rid of freedom completely. So that's one strand in the European tradition, and it goes through post-Darwin into the Anglo-American, broadly speaking, the Anglo-American philosophical tradition, or sometimes called analytic philosophy, which begins in Cambridge in 1903. It's slightly misleading because the great founders of the Anglo-American tradition are Gottlob Frege and Ludwig Wittgenstein. And we've sort of, we haven't quite inherited Frege, but we adopted Wittgenstein. And we treat him as a Cambridge man, not the Austrian that he is, and certainly was in his character. And so that tradition, ever since, that broadly speaking, the Anglo-American tradition sees philosophy as being in the back seat to the natural sciences. Occasionally the philosopher might come forward and whisper something in the scientist's, in the physicist's ear, but broadly speaking, he's sitting in the back seat. This is the Stephen Hawking view of philosophy. Science has been so successful since the Enlightenment. What do we need philosophy for? What do we need philosophy for? It's not just theology. Remember Kant. Once you've got a complete, exhaustive scientific picture of the world, no need for soul, no need for freedom, no need for God, and no need for metaphysics, no need for philosophy. The Critique of Pure Reason, 1781, it opens with this magnificent attack on metaphysics. All metaphysics up till me, says Kant, has always overreached itself. It pretends to be the queen of the sciences, and it always goes beyond what is given to us in sense experience. And it gets muddled and it gets confused. And natural theology, he thinks, is a good example of that. So that's one tradition, one way in which, one piece of Humpty Dumpty. The other piece is an elevation of freedom, where freedom becomes absolutely everything. And here you see, beginning in the thought of Martin Heidegger, Being in Time, Sein und Zeit, 1927, where you have a repudiation of this idea that the sciences are the be-all and end-all. And the great mechanism or idea of Dasein comes into the fore in European philosophy. Very few people, I try to get my students to read Being in Time, very few people have actually read Being in Time, but really that text marks the beginning of the continental philosophical tradition. And really the French existentialists are stealing a lot of those ideas, and in particular in the figure of Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus and others, freedom is fetishized. Freedom becomes everything. But it's an anarchic freedom. It's a freedom from any kind of constraint. It's like the other extreme of determinism. It's freedom without any constraint at all. Pure will to power, in effect. It's freedom, it's the opposite of the freedom that Jesus is implying in John 8:32. Why? Because for Sartre, moral freedom, a state of moral purity through which we are that we are liberated by when we come to know the truth, is a cage. It's a form of captivity. It's a form of oppression by bourgeois conventions. And so we have this extraordinary notion. I mean, think of the opening of Camus' wonderful L'étranger. Maman est décédée hier, ou peut-être c'était avant-hier, je ne me rappelle plus. Mother died yesterday, or maybe it was the day before. I can't remember. That's how free I am. I'm so free that I'm free even from the closest bond that any two human beings can have between them. Now, this is not freedom in any sense that the Christian tradition recognizes. This is a diabolical conception of freedom. And though I don't want to talk politics, I would suggest, and I've been having many debates about this in the UK with sympathetic friends, that notion of freedom is very much at the heart of modern liberalism. that freedom is upstream of everything else. I take the view that the only freedom that's worth having is freedom that is constrained and ordered by three other F's: faith, family, flag. And that's when freedom starts to have meaning, and that's where freedom starts to be conducive to your flourishing and to the flourishing of your community and to your family, your congregations, and your nation. Liberalism puts freedom first. The self-legislating, autonomous freedom, that's what we start with. And any obligations that I haven't chosen, I haven't freely chosen, are suspect, including the obligations to my closest kin. And that's what we see in the existentialist elevation of freedom. So I hope you've followed me. I didn't want to give you too much of a philosophy lesson, but can you get the sense of the way these currents operate? And, this radical determinism, it doesn't matter, we're just like animals. We're shaped by our heredity, our environment, or our psychology, increasingly. We have shifted from the language of sin to the language of syndrome. We pathologize moral failure to our detriment, not just to the damage of society, but to the damage of our own selves. One of the things I lament in the Protestant tradition, the absence of in the Protestant tradition, even the sort of Anglican tradition, we can never quite make up our minds whether we're Protestant or not. But one thing we have lost is the confessional. I've been an Anglican for 20 years, and we don't have that mechanism of the confessional, that mechanism of, as it were, reflecting on moral failure and seeking freedom from it. Seeking the freedom that Jesus promises in John 8:32. We don't have it. And what we do is when you pathologize something, you turn a sin into a syndrome, you can never be free. It's something you're stuck with. Maybe you can manage it through medication. But medication is not medicine. It's a way of coping, perhaps, and sometimes it's necessary, don't get me wrong, sometimes it's important, but, I lost a dear friend earlier this year, and we've just discovered that it was almost certainly due to medication. He was a Christian, and I'm convinced that had he had certain sacraments and mechanisms to sort of think about the struggles that he was going through in his life, that he would have had a much better chance of coping with them. So there we go. We're thinking about freedom, we're thinking about moral freedom. And I want to just touch very briefly, before I move on to the political dimension of freedom, and freedom of religion in particular, just to note other religious traditions. Within Islam, for example, freedom, or fiqh, is understood to come through submission, through abnegation, and in particular submission to the will of Allah. This bears some resemblance to Christianity. Think of Dante's wonderful line, "In la sua volontate è la nostra pace." It is in doing your will that we find our peace. So that's not an idea that is rebarbative or difficult for the Christian to understand. The key difference, though, I think emerges in that wonderful passage later on in John 15, where Jesus explains submission, or doing the will of the Father, doing his will, as a gateway to friendship. That's a gateway to friendship. I call you friends if you do my bidding. It was a very puzzling verse, that. But the idea, I think, is that once you come to know the Logos, you come to submit yourself to the Logos, you find not just freedom, but friendship with God. It's a stunning thought. And it's a thought that the Greek mind could not cope with. It's a thought that the Roman mind could not cope with either. And I would say it's a thought that the Islamic mind cannot cope with either. Friendship with Allah is completely heretical. Submission that issues in friendship is something that it can't cope with at all. We could go on. I mean, I just touch on some of the Eastern traditions. The tradition I know best is Advaita Vedanta, the tradition of non-duality in Indian metaphysics. And there the thought is knowledge is important for salvation or moksha, but that freedom is not the freedom that Jesus talks about. It's not a sense of personal relation and moral purity and moral freedom. Moksha is salvation from all of me. It's salvation from the self. Moksha is the moment where you realize, in Hindu metaphysics, that you are not you, that there is no you, that yourself and all your desires and all of your moral impulses and intuitions and sense of moral failure is simply an illusion that needs to be escaped through knowledge. So knowledge is really the gateway to the erasure of the self and self-knowledge. So I've given you some examples there of the way in which freedom is understood in these different traditions, secular, religious, and we've looked too at this unusual relationship between knowledge and morality, which Plato and Aristotle found so difficult, but which I think Jesus of Nazareth resolves in John 8 and Paul illuminates further down the line. I'm going to move now to think about a paradox that struck me as I was thinking about this verse earlier this week, and particularly in the context in which I think many of us find ourselves, which is that we don't feel as free as we used to feel as Christians to come to know and explore the truth. So we've got a sort of paradox. The claim that if you know the truth will set you free. But how can you come to know the truth if you do not have a sufficient level of political freedom to explore the truth? So how does this work? I mean, if in a totalitarian society where Christian practice is a capital offense, North Korea, you'll never come to know the truth. You'll never come to even entertain the truth. And so how will you ever get that more ultimate freedom, that salvific salvation freedom further down the line? This is a paradox. And here's the interesting thing, and I just want to really stress this thought. Your secular friends will tell you that freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, all the democratic freedoms are fruits of the Aufklärung, of the Enlightenment. This is nonsense. Freedom of religion, that phrase, libertas religionis, is a fruit of early Christianity. And we know that because we can see it. We can see it come up in the texts. If you look at Tertullian, the first great Latin church father, wrote a very short and easy to read little book, you find it online, called The Apology, the first apologia. And he argues in that work that freedom in matters of religion is vital. This was an extraordinary thought to the Roman mind, and we can see in these texts and these criticisms of the early Christians that they can't even think of Christianity as a religion. Pliny writes to Trajan, and he says, this is a superstitio. It's a superstition. It's subversive. It's a strange kind of cult. Because they're atheists, they are cannibals, they are incestuous. These are the charges that the Romans level at the early Christians because they don't understand the Christian resistance to simply absorbing their God into the civic religion. They couldn't understand this at all. This made them subversive. It's fine, you can have your Christ, you do that, but just make sure you burn your pinch of incense to Caesar as well. Why would you not want to do that? It's just a pinch, tiny pinch of incense, showing your loyalty to the empire, and then you can do what you want. And Tertullian resists this. And you see in the outworking of his thought in the 2nd century and the thought of others, the importance of belief and inner conviction in matters of religion. And you start to see the emergence of this idea that faith is something that is personally transformative and that belief can't be coerced. You can't be made to believe something. If you think about it, try. Imagine a circumstance. You might be persuaded to believe something, but you can't be forced to believe something. And so you begin to see the emergence of the language of freedom of religion as a jus humanum. This is the phrase that Tertullian uses, jus humanum, a right that belongs to us as human beings. Now, again, it's difficult to overemphasize how strange and barbaric this language was. A jus humanum that extends beyond the scope of Roman citizenship? This is inconceivable. And the reason for that is that until the dawn of early Christianity, there were no human beings. Before the 1st century AD, there were no human beings. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that it made no sense to talk about human beings. There were Athenians, there were Hittites, there were Persians, there were non-Greeks, there were barbaroi, because all they could speak was rhubarb. There were non-citizens, there were slaves. But what would it mean for there to be a category in which all of these different ethnicities were treated as being endowed with equal moral worth? This is a thought that is simply inconceivable within the Roman mind. But Tertullian stresses, no, this is something that all human beings are endowed with. And so we see this emergence of, even within Christendom, even after Constantine, you see this sense that even though we are now in charge, even though Christians are now in charge, at least of the eastern half of the empire, we need to recognize that there is a distinction between the city of God and the city of man. This is Augustine's great achievement in the city of God, which he writes over the course of 25 years between 410 and 426 AD. And you start to see these clashes emerging. And what you see is the birth of the secular. Once upon a time, there was no secular. Secularity emerges as another fruit of Christianity. There is no secular in Hinduism. There is no secular in Islam. And if you think about it, it's very rational, particularly for a monotheistic tradition, to refuse the secular. Islam's political theology is, in many ways, a lot more consistent and coherent than Christian political theology. Islam, if God is in charge, if God is the source of all reality distinct from himself, sustaining it in being at every moment of its existence, what else would you want to be in charge? And God has revealed what he wants, how he wants human beings to conduct themselves and so on. Why would you organize society in a way that was agnostic about that? It makes no sense. But Christianity insists that it does make sense, because coercion in belief means that there can be no freedom in belief. And no freedom in belief means that that's a belief that's not worth having. That a relationship with God that is not entered into freely is not a relationship worth having. And Christianity was willing to pay the price, as it turns out, an enormous price, of taking the gamble of opening up the secular public square, the seculum. The seculum, simply the word from Latin, seculare, seculum meaning century, the temporal order, the cycle of centuries as opposed to the eternal order. And so you begin to see these big clashes emerge. You think of Henry at Canossa, or you think of Henry II of England and Thomas of Becket. You think of the great clashes that emerge as we try to work out what the connection is between political freedom and salvation freedom. But this is what emerges, and really in the Enlightenment we see a development of this conception. It's traditional to say that political freedom and freedom of religion as we understand it today emerges out of the so-called wars of religion of the 16th and 17th century that tore apart this landscape, of course, and Europe to an appalling degree. Now, my own view is that this is a secular myth. Protestants were perfectly capable of massacring Protestants, and Catholics were perfectly capable and did massacre lots of Catholics. I don't think what you saw there really was the wars of religion. What you saw, I think, were the birth pangs of secularism. You saw the emergence of the secular modern nation state, finally in the Treaty of Westphalia, of course, in 1648. And you have the emergence of this myth of the neutral public square. And that myth, in various ways, is what has persisted to today. So in Cambridge and in almost every English-speaking faculty in the West at the moment, the king of political philosophy is a man called John Rawls, who some of you may have heard of. His Theory of Justice, 1971, which just passed its 50th anniversary, is probably the Bible for secular political philosophers in the West. And I don't want to talk about Rawls too much, but the key point to understand is that what he calls comprehensive metaphysical assumptions must be bracketed. You must suspend your religious beliefs. You must suspend all beliefs that might be contentious in the public square as you try to imagine what an ideally just society might look like. Jürgen Habermas has a similar version of this. Now, that model is unraveling. It has certainly been unraveling since 2016, when various two political events in at least the Anglosphere West led to an extraordinary eruption of non-rational forces and non-rational commitments. And the Rawlsian paradigm is beginning to unravel, I think. And so the question, just as I draw things to a close, the question for us to think about as Christians is, how do we find freedom? How do we find the freedom that's going to let us come to know the truth that will give us the freedom that Jesus talks about in John 8? How do we do that? in an increasingly hostile world. What's something the sociologist Aaron Renn has called negative world. Aaron Renn, I'm hosting an event with him in a couple of weeks. He's just released a book called Negative World. The idea here is that to be a Christian in the West, up until, from roughly speaking, 1990, was to have social capital. It's not that everybody was a Christian, but if you were a Christian, you were regarded with some respect and somebody who was morally upstanding and a pillar of the community. And Renn says, now his analysis is America, and so I think things would be different in Germany, certainly different in the United Kingdom. Maybe we would have gone a little bit faster. But what he says is, I think the triptych is well taken. You move from positive world to neutral world. From the 1990s onwards, it didn't really matter if you were a Christian. There was no special social capital, didn't mark you out particularly. Multiculturalism was now dawning. To be a Christian was very common to be a Christian. It was effectively neutral. It's neither good nor bad. And in or around 2010, 2011, 2012, Renn says, certainly in the United States, we shifted from neutral world to negative world, where there is now a social cost to being a Christian. That is to say, a social cost to being a Christian who refuses to conform to the ideologies and orthodoxies of secular progressivism. And the question then is, how do we cope with negative world as Christians? We're so used to the Constantinian settlement. What would it mean to go back to the catacombs? Now, a word in favor of catacombs. Constantinianism, the entire Roman Empire was captured by people spending a few decades in the catacombs. Catacombs were in the city, but not of the city. They were in the world, but not of the world. They were in the empire, at the heart of empire, but not of the empire. Christians in the catacombs didn't just hide down there all the time. They had day jobs. They would go to work during the day. But they had a place, a secret place, secret handshakes, secret ways of acknowledging each other, marking each other's houses, where they could meet in private, celebrate the Eucharist, give each other strength and support, catechize each other. Catechism is very important too. And so those of us we emerge now, as it were, in the carcass of Christendom, of a kind of Constantinian settlement, we need to be thinking, what do catacombs look like today? I want to suggest that what we're doing now is a kind of catacomb. Gathering together, it's not particularly secret, but it's gathering together from different parts of the country, different parts of Europe, talking to each other, grappling with ideas, supporting each other, catechizing each other. That's important. Digital catacombs are very powerful as well. I sometimes joke with my Catholic friends that what we're seeing at the moment, this cultural revolution, is at least as significant for the West as the Reformation was 500 years ago. The transvaluation of value that Nietzsche talks about, reversing everything, normophobia, the pervasive normophobia in the West today is as epochal as the Reformation. And what happened in the Reformation? Not far from here. Well, you have three basic strands. You have the Lutheran strand, the Calvinist strand, and the Melanchthon Anabaptists. And all three of those modes of Christian reaction, I think, are modes of reaction we can think about today. What's Luther? Early on, Luther says, I don't want to break up the Catholic Church. Ecclesia semper reformanda. We can fix these institutions, these rotting institutions, and we can fix them from within. So those of us who have made our way into the institutions, I'm in a university, a very big institution. I don't plan to leave it. I don't plan to burn it down. I'm going to do what I can to ensure it's flourishing from within. Some of my friends have got fed up with the institutions, and they are entering into Calvin mode. And their view is that the institutions are rotten, the institutions are captured. We need a new Geneva. We need parallel institutions. And so we're seeing new universities being set up, new charities being set up that are much more focused, much more insulated against ideological capture. And then there's the third strand, what I call the digital Anabaptists. And the digital Anabaptists are those who say, well, let's just get rid of all institutions altogether. Why do we need institutions? Why don't we focus on networks? And this is not a bad idea. Networks have all kinds of advantages that institutions do not have. Networks can grow geometrically rather than arithmetically. They can grow very, very fast. Networks can be much more responsive to particular problems as they arise. Institutions are much slower to adapt. And in a cultural revolution that is unleashing enormous new changes in our moral and social landscapes, having a very responsive mechanism for that is extremely effective. Johannes was kind enough to mention ARC earlier. In some ways, that is what ARC is. It is a network drawing on people from within different institutions, but operating in a much more mobile, flexible way. Networks are quite cheap. We need to be thinking about financial independence and financial resilience, and networks are relatively, compared to institutions, relatively easy to invest and to finance and to fund. And they're also relatively easy they cope with disagreement very well, and it's very easy to connect different networks to one another. So those would be three models of engagement that you should think about, and it's not a zero-sum game. If you find yourself in a prestigious institution, don't leave. See what you can do to change from within. But also it's worth supporting the emergence of parallel institutions as well. That can be very effective. And the digital Anabaptist era, the ecosystem of podcasts, of discussions, of gatherings like this, of Substack. I don't know if you read these Substacks. These are very, very effective ways in which ideas can be conveyed and ideas can be debated in a way that resists the censorship that we are beginning to see all across the West these days. Finally, I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts, hopeful thoughts. G.K. Chesterton once said, 5 times in the history of Christianity, Christianity went to the dogs. Right, just finished. And every time, it was the dog that died. Now, he was talking about Arianism, Albigensianism, Renaissance humanism, the Reformation. This was after his Catholic conversion, and Enlightenment humanism, and we might now add a kind of woke progressivism to that. Christianity always buries its undertakers. It has enormous resilience. And you don't need me to tell you this, just look at the numbers. Look at just Pentecostal Christianity. I don't think I know any Pentecostal Christian, or very few. But in 1900, you know how many Pentecostal Christians there were in the world? 0. You know how many it's estimated, on a conservative estimate, there's going to be in 2050? 1 billion. Pentecostalism alone, if it were just its own religion, and we can debate about the theology and so on, but if it were just its own religion, would be the fastest growing religion in human history. Christianity in China, it's very difficult to get numbers that are accurate, and things seem to have stabilized, or the numbers seem to have stabilized a little bit since President Xi's aggressive persecution against them. But I mean, just think, 1969, there are maybe 100,000 Christians in all of China. 40 years later, despite 0 organized Western missionary network and 0 funding and extraordinary repression, the number of Christians in China is hitting 100, 110, 120 million. Extraordinary growth. In Africa too. So, in fact, the only place that Christianity is not really growing is the northwestern rim of Eurasia. Us. The question is not, can Christianity survive without the West? The question is, can the West survive without Christianity? And it's your task and my task to ensure that the West does survive. And in order for it to survive, it needs to have at its heart Christianity. And it needs to have at its heart that knowledge of the truth that will make us free. Thank you for listening.